On a warm afternoon in the summer of 1944, the quiet French village at the heart of this story was still very much alive, full of movement, voices, and the rhythms of ordinary life. Then came the SS, and within hours, nearly every soul in that place had been murdered, every building reduced to ash and cinder. The ruins that remain today have been left almost exactly as they fell, untouched across nearly 8 decades, and they stand now as one of the most shattering monuments to the darkest chapter of the Second World War. Drawing on the accounts of those who survived alongside cutting-edge digital reconstruction technology, we will walk through that village as it once was and piece together the full story of the day soldiers descended on Oradour-sur-Glane. By the time Allied troops first set foot on the beaches of Normandy that June, the German military was already fighting from a position of deep weakness. Outmatched on both the sea and in the skies, they were relying on a patchwork of second-rate coastal garrison units and dangerously thin reserves to hold back the western advance. Under those conditions, elite formations like the SS Das Reich Panzer Division became absolutely critical, irreplaceable assets the Germans could not afford to keep idle. Stationed in southern France and still in the process of reconstituting its strength, the division received urgent orders to push north toward Normandy at maximum speed. Directly in the path of that northward march lay the unsuspecting village of Oradour-sur-Glane. In 1944, Oradour was a modest rural settlement, nothing particularly remarkable about it to the outside world, yet quietly alive in its own way. Before the war, roughly 1,300 people had called it home. That number had since grown, swelled by arrivals fleeing the annexed Alsace-Lorraine borderlands, refugees escaping Franco's dictatorship in Spain, and several families of French Jews who had found in this tranquil backwater a refuge from the violence spreading across the continent. Walking through the shattered remnants of this place today, it takes real effort of imagination to picture the living community that once filled these streets, but through the painstaking analysis of hundreds of wartime photographs and aerial surveys, it becomes possible to reconstruct that world with striking precision. Let us turn back the clock and step into the village as it appeared in the summer of 1944. Tracing the path of the main tram line running toward the city of Limoges, a visitor would have spotted Avril's hotel standing on the left side of the road, with Monsieur Denis's well-frequented wine shop directly across from it. Continuing along the street past the surrounding homes, one would have reached Monsieur Bochol's workshop on the left, recognizable from a distance by the prominent fuel pump stationed outside it. Just beyond, a turn to the left revealed the village pharmacy on the far corner, and further ahead opened the broad expanse of the village green. Doubling back and following the road where it curved to the left, set a little back on the right-hand side stood the girls' school, where headmistress Madame Binet presided over a class of 106 children. A couple of doors along was Monsieur Desortos's motor garage, followed in close succession by the butcher's and Monsieur Campagne's bakery, sitting on opposite sides of Rue Desortos. Pressing further into the main residential quarter, a lane broke off to the left past the Laudie family home, beyond which the Laudie barn came into view on the same side. Deeper into that street lay the old village cemetery and the communal well that was so central to daily life. Turning back onto the widening main thoroughfare, the last cluster of buildings appeared, among them Madame Milord's café with its adjoining house and barn, all positioned on the right. One final turning to the left led toward the smaller school built to serve the children of Alsace-Lorraine refugees, and straight ahead, its back pressed against the tree line along the river Glane, stood Monsieur Bochol's barn. Rising above everything else at the top of the street was the commanding silhouette of St. Martin's Church, a 13th-century structure whose distinctive spire had for generations served as both the spiritual and physical heart of the community. Leaving Oradour to its peace for the moment, we shift our attention southward by some 150 miles. It was here, in the early days of June, that the notorious Das Reich Division, a Waffen-SS armored formation whose reputation for savagery was thoroughly earned, found itself. During this period in the south of France, the division was absorbing new recruits to replace its losses, among them a significant number of French-speaking men from Alsace who had been conscripted under duress. At full operational strength, the Das Reich numbered approximately 19,000 soldiers, organized around its principal combat elements, the 2nd SS Panzer Regiment, the 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment Deutschland, the 4th Panzergrenadier Regiment Der Führer, and a range of smaller specialist units. Within the Der Führer Regiment, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Sylvestre Stadler, 3 battalions formed the backbone of the formation. The 1st Battalion was under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, 29 years old, a committed ideologue who had joined the Nazi Party in 1933, suffered serious wounds in France during the 1940 campaign, and gone on to serve on the Eastern Front. Among the 4 infantry companies operating beneath Diekmann was the 3rd Company, led by Hauptsturmführer Otto Kahn. It would be this unit that would leave its name forever darkened by what occurred at Oradour. To understand the events that followed, it is essential first to grasp the urgency with which the Das Reich needed to reach Normandy. By June 7, the Allied beachhead was solidifying rapidly, 5 landing zones were being consolidated simultaneously, and thousands of soldiers and vehicles were pouring ashore with every passing hour. Each day's delay made the task of throwing back the invasion exponentially harder. On that same date, General Heinz Lammerding, commanding the Das Reich, received explicit orders to move north without hesitation and join the fighting. The fastest and most obvious route north for the division's armored vehicles was by rail. With favorable conditions, the roughly 450-mile journey could have been completed in as little as 3 days, putting the Das Reich in action before the Allied foothold became truly unassailable. But an extraordinary act of sabotage had already closed that option. A 16-year-old girl and a handful of her schoolmates, working through the Special Operations Executives Pimento network, had slipped into the Montauban railyard under cover of darkness in April 1944. Armed with an abrasive compound, they had methodically seized the axle bearings on more than 90 flat cars that had been designated for transporting the division, a feat of quiet courage that almost certainly spared a great many Allied lives in the weeks that followed. With rail transit no longer viable, the entire convoy was forced onto the roads. This was far from ideal. Armored vehicles are mechanically temperamental machines, and a 450-mile road march guaranteed not only severe delays but significant mechanical breakdown, especially among the tanks. Nevertheless, on the morning of June 8, at 8 o'clock, the lead vehicles of a 1,400-strong convoy pulled out of Montauban and began heading north. Trouble found them almost immediately. Energized by word of the Normandy landings, French resistance fighters harried the Das Reich relentlessly as it moved. At Cahors the column divided in 2, the Der Führer Regiment led the western route while the bulk of the division's armor took the eastern road. Ambushes at Groljak, Carsac, and Ruffalac could not stop the column outright, but each attack drew blood and ate into the schedule. By June 9 the march had deteriorated into something approaching a nightmare, and an order was circulated directing units to break the spirit of the population through exemplary reprisals. On that very same day, soldiers from the Das Reich's reconnaissance battalion operating on the right-hand column entered the town of Toul, where French resistance fighters had besieged the German garrison. With their superior firepower the SS broke the lightly armed Maquis and then rounded up every adult male in the town. They subsequently hanged 99 men from the lamp posts and balconies along the streets, stopping only when the supply of rope gave out. But even greater horror was still to come. 2 events on June 9 would prove directly relevant to what happened next. The first involved a German officer named Karl Gerlach who, while scouting for overnight accommodation ahead of the left column's advance, was seized by resistance fighters near the town of Nile. He managed to escape several hours later, though his driver was not so fortunate. In his subsequent report, Gerlach made a claim that would become fiercely disputed by historians, that during the hours of his captivity he had been held, at least briefly, in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane. The second event unfolded in Limoges, where the commander of the Der Führer's 3rd Battalion, Helmut Kampfi, described by his peers as an exceptional officer and a personal friend of Diekmann, was captured by the resistance while traveling alone in a vehicle. He was never seen alive again, almost certainly executed by his captors. Word of Kampfi's disappearance struck Diekmann like a personal wound, and his response to the news would help set the stage for the catastrophe at Oradour. On the morning of June 10, 1944, Diekmann appeared before Stadler, the regimental commander, and requested authorization to take his battalion to Oradour-sur-Glane. He claimed to have received intelligence, from Gerlach, and reportedly from a member of the resistance who had come forward, suggesting that Camphy was being held there. Stadler later testified that he had sanctioned the operation only to the extent of taking hostages and making an orderly search of the village. What actually happened that day was something of an entirely different order. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the village's inhabitants were ordered to assemble on the fairground, ostensibly for a routine identity document inspection, as the SS had led them to believe. Farmers came in from surrounding fields, the men and women of the village gathered, and pupils were collected from all 3 schools. Altogether some 400 to 450 people assembled on the open ground as the soldiers fanned out through every corner of the village. Anyone found still inside their home was dragged out and directed toward the square. Once the assembly was complete, the men were separated from the women and children and marched in groups to 6 different locations around the village: barns, a wine cellar, a garage. The women and children, somewhere between 400 and 450 in total, were escorted to the Church of St. Martin. What happened next has been reconstructed from the accounts of a tiny number of survivors, each of whom carried their testimony at tremendous personal cost. In the wine warehouse, a witness named Armand Seenan described the sequence of events: the Germans setting up a machine gun, the explosion of an incendiary device, and then the shooting that began immediately afterward. Wounded and trapped beneath a pile of bodies, Seenan survived only because the dead fell on top of him. He and a small number of others managed to crawl out through the smoke and flames and escape across the fields. Inside the church, the women and children waited in growing fear and confusion as the afternoon stretched on. Then something was thrown inside, accounts differ as to exactly what, and a choking, suffocating smoke began to fill the nave. When the panicked congregation surged toward the door, they met machine gun fire. Those who attempted to break through the windows were shot down. The priest made a desperate attempt to smash open a rear door. He was killed where he stood. One woman, Madame Marguerite Ruffranche, managed to pull herself through a window above the altar, dropped to the ground below, and crawled into the adjoining garden. She was shot 5 times. Most of the shots that struck her did not kill her, and she lay hidden between rows of vegetables as the afternoon and the night passed over her. Among the men in Madame Laudier's barn, a young man named Marcel Darthout bore witness to the horror from inside the growing pile of bodies. He later recalled how an explosion was followed immediately by gunfire, a command to fire, and the simultaneous roar of 2 machine guns. The first burst tore into his legs and dropped him. More rounds struck him as he fell. He was buried under the bodies of friends, and it was only that grim weight that kept him alive. The Germans walked among the fallen, delivering a finishing shot to anyone who moved. One such shot, fired directly next to Darthout, killed the man who was lying on top of him. Shot 4 times in total and badly burned when petrol was poured across the barn and ignited, Darthout ultimately escaped by concealing himself in an adjoining structure and then in a stone rabbit hutch. He was one of only 5 men from that location to survive. The same scene of methodical slaughter played out in the 5 other holding sites across the village, the SS moving calmly from place to place. Once the killing was complete, the looting began. From approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, the soldiers moved systematically through the ruins, stripping valuables, alcohol, and anything else of use before setting each building alight in turn. When nothing remained to take, they climbed back into their vehicles and drove away down the same road they had arrived on less than 8 hours before. Behind them they left 643 dead, men, women and children, and the village of Oradour-sur-Glane burning against the darkening sky, visible for miles across the countryside. When dawn came on June 11, the full enormity of what had been done began to emerge. A handful of people who had somehow avoided the roundup and spent the night concealed in terror crept slowly out of their hiding places. Others arrived from neighboring villages, parents who had grown frantic when their children failed to come home from school the previous day. At 6 in the morning, a house where a small SS rearguard had spent the night was set on fire and the last soldiers drove away. Only then could survivors begin to walk through the ashes. Among the first to approach the church was a man named Hyvernaud, searching for his two sons, aged 8 and 10. He found the younger one almost immediately, lying on his side, half-burned. The older boy was nowhere to be found. Gathered behind the altar were at least 20 small children who had pressed together seeking shelter. None of them had survived the smoke and the flames. He noted afterward, with a grief beyond bitterness, that not a single adult had taken refuge behind the altar. Every mother had left that last corner of shelter to the children. For those who had been absent from Oradour that day for one reason or another, away on an errand, detained elsewhere, returning meant discovering that an entire household, every member of a family, had vanished. Such discoveries continued for days. Among the very last survivors to be located at Oradour was Madame Refranche, who had lain in the vegetable garden for more than 48 hours. Her voice, thin but audible, was heard calling out from among the plants. She would spend a full year recovering in hospital. Her physical wounds eventually closed. Her inner ones never did. Aware that they had committed something that could not easily be explained away, some of the perpetrators returned to Oradour in the days that followed and made half-hearted attempts to bury the dead and obscure the extent of the destruction. The task proved too vast and was eventually abandoned. It was not until French aid workers arrived some days later that the work of identification could seriously begin, and even then it was nearly impossible. Of the 643 killed, only 52 were ever formally identified. The repercussions within the German military were swift. As word of what had happened spread through the command structure, senior officers demanded answers. Formal protests were lodged by the Vichy government. Stadler, who later maintained he had ordered nothing beyond the taking of hostages, registered his own objection. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel became entangled in the affair. Internal court-martial proceedings were initiated against Diekmann, who was widely judged to have far exceeded whatever orders he had received. The inquiry did not last long. Within weeks, Diekmann and a large portion of those responsible had been killed in action in Normandy, and the process was quietly allowed to lapse. A formal trial was finally held in Bordeaux in 1953, with 21 surviving SS men in the dock, 14 of them from Alsace. 20 were convicted, 2 condemned to death. Yet in the way that became all too familiar across a Europe exhausted by the war and desperate to move forward, every sentence was subsequently reduced, and by 1958 every one of the men convicted had walked free. Later proceedings included the trial of Heinz Barth, a platoon commander in Kahn's 3rd Company, who became the sole officer ever formally convicted in connection with the massacre. He served 14 years. The question of who ultimately ordered the killings and where the chain of responsibility truly ends remains unresolved to this day, and no one who bore guilt for what happened at Oradour was ever made to pay a price commensurate with their crime. The ruins were never rebuilt. A new village was eventually constructed a little further north to house those who had survived the war. As for the old site, in the months following Germany's defeat, President Charles de Gaulle formally declared Oradour a village martyr, ordering that the ruins be preserved precisely as they were, an enduring monument to the sacrifice of an entire community. The site remains open to visitors, and those who walk through it today are struck less by its scale than by the intimacy of what remains: the sewing machines still sitting on their tables, the bicycles propped against crumbling walls, the rusted hulks of automobiles that went nowhere, the well that no one draws water from, and above all, a small pram sitting alone, with neither the child nor the mother who should be beside it. Not far away, the town cemetery holds the remains of the dead. Headstones mark the loss of entire families, erased in a single afternoon. Among the most haunting memorials are those bearing photographs, the young and the old, each face a reminder of someone who was alive on the morning of June 10 and was not by nightfall. Perhaps the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane speak to something larger than one village's fate. The painful truth is that this story is not singular. Across the same continent and the same years, hundreds of other communities were obliterated in the same fashion, places in Central and Eastern Europe whose names have long since disappeared from living memory, their stories buried beneath the weight of time.